Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex intelligence, really distill it down so you know what truly matters. Today, we're opening up some sources on arguably the most dangerous and, frankly, sophisticated criminal group operating right now. We're talking about the Los Chapitos faction of the Sinaloa cartel, specifically the engine driving their fentanyl empire.
Yeah, and the stakes, well, they couldn't really be higher. Our mission today is a deep dive into the big U.S. government action recently. We're focusing on the October 6th, 2025 Treasury sanctions. The idea was basically cut off the supply chain at the source, stop those precursor chemicals they need for fentanyl production.
Exactly. But the real question here, the thing we're going to stress test throughout this deep dive, is whether these sanctions, they look powerful on paper, right?
Yeah.
But will they actually stick? How do they hold up against the cartel's, legendary resilience?
And that's the hook for you listening. It's the urgency. We're going to lay out precisely who got hit, how Treasury did it. But the intelligence we're looking at is pretty clear, almost certain, actually. The clock is ticking. Experts are predicting this whole network, the parts that got hit, they'll likely be back up and running, functionally reconstituted in less than 30 days.
Wow. Okay, so that's the central tension then, this race between, major government action and just incredibly rapid criminal adaptation.
Right. And to really get a handle on what was targeted, you first have to understand the fentanyl factory itself. The fentanyl flows from, halfway across the world right into the U.S.
Okay, let's break that down. Step one, the precursor chemicals. These are the raw ingredients needed to actually make fentanyl. They're sourced, overwhelmingly still, from China, shipped across the Pacific into Mexico. Now, we used to think of China as the main source of finished fentanyl, too, but that apparently shifted around 2019. Mexico reportedly took over as the primary source of the finished drug heading to the U.S., but they're still heavily reliant on those Chinese precursors.
That's step one. Step two, those chemicals arrive in Mexico and head to clandestine labs. Secret labs, mostly in Sinaloa, which is the cartel's home turf. That's where they cook the fentanyl powder and press it into those fake pills that are so dangerous.
Okay. Step three. The final product gets smuggled across the border into the U.S. And they use, pretty much every method imaginable. Cars, trucks, boats, planes, even tunnels underground. Then, once it's in, it gets distributed nationwide through their networks.
And then steps 4 and 5 kind of close that loop. Step 4 is, maintaining control. That involves the violence, the intimidation, the fear tactics we associate with these groups. And step 5 is absolutely crucial. The money. Laundering billions in profit. They use cash, sure, but also goods, trade-based laundering, and increasingly crypto, getting that money back to Mexico to fuel the whole cycle again.
And who's running this specific show? The Los Chapitos faction.
It's led by Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar. They're brothers, both fugitives. They really took the reins after Ovidio Guzman López was taken into custody and extradited.
Got it. And the scale of this operation. The sources tie specific seizures to this Chapitos investigation, right? What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Huge numbers. The seizures that underpin this specific October 6th action were significant. Investigators confiscated 82 pounds of fentanyl precursor chemicals, so the raw stuff, then 231 pounds of actual fentanyl powder, and maybe most chillingly, over 2.5 million fentanyl-laced pills.
2.5 million pills. Let's just pause on that. When you add it all up, what do the sources say? Over 22.7 million potential deadly doses. Just from those seizures alone, pulled off the street. That really frames the size of the target the Treasury was aiming for.
Exactly. That's the machine they tried to break on October 6th, 2025.
So we understand the target. Now let's talk about the weapon the government used, the sanction shock, as you called it. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, sanctioned 8 Mexican individuals, 12 companies based in Mexico. Things they've tried before.
It's the type of authority they use. It's this dual authority approach. This wasn't just your standard counter-narcotics designation under, say, the Kingpin Act. They brought out the heavy artillery using both that Counter-Narcotics Authority Executive Order 14059 and Counter-Terrorism Authority Executive Order 13224.
Okay, counterterrorism, that sounds serious. Why is that dual designation so critical here?
It changes the game entirely. See, the Sinaloa cartel as a whole was designated a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, back in February 2025. were hit with a specially designated Global Terrorist SDGT designation in June 2025. This elevates it way beyond just a law enforcement issue. It makes it a global financial warfare problem. Any bank, anywhere in the world that deals with their money faces massive risk. It triggers automatic screening, asset freezes globally. It's a much bigger hammer.
So applying that hammer, who exactly did they hit? You said they aimed for the chemical suppliers in Culiacán, the choke point.
Precisely. The main target highlighted was a company called Sumilab, SA to CV, based in Culiacán, a known chemical supplier. And this wasn't the first time for Sumilab. They were actually sanctioned back in May 2023, but, well, they adapted. They kept operating. So this new action went broader. It targeted the family allegedly running Sumilab, the Favela López siblings, Victor Andres, Francisco, Jorge Luis, Maria Gabriela. And it hit their known associates too, like Sheriff Verdugo Araujo and Gilberto Gallardo Garcia.
And this is where we see that resilience, that adaptation in action, this idea of corporate layering. What did they do after those first Sumilab sanctions in 2023? The sources say something almost ridiculously simple.
Yeah, it sounds basic, but it's effective. They allegedly just removed the signs from the Sumilab storefronts. They treat these sanctioned entities like, well, like a snake shedding its skin. Just leave the old identity behind and create a new one. They change names on paperwork, install front persons or straw owners, people who appear to be in charge but aren't. Like a guy named Cesar Elias Lopez Araujo, who is apparently put in charge of a new entity called Lab Importaciones y Nacional Lab.
So that's corporate layering. You set up shell companies, maybe owned by other shell companies, or just have front people running the same business from the same place under a new name. It's designed to confuse, to make it almost impossible for OFAC or investigators to follow the real ownership and control, a deliberate maze.
Exactly. It buys them time, wastes investigative resources. So this time, Treasury tried to hit the whole organism. They sanctioned a network of related shell companies allegedly run by the family names like AgroLaren, Viand, Favelab, Quilab, Storelab. They even went after a key chemical broker, Martha Emilia Conde Iraga, and her companies, including, interestingly, a real estate firm, Rocco del Pacifico Inmobiliaria. Shows you how tangled the logistics and the money laundering are.
Okay, which brings us to maybe the most critical part of this deep dive. Stress testing the claims. The action was broad, used powerful tools like the SDGT designation. So the big question, does it actually work? What's the intelligence predict long term?
Well, in the very short term, the picture looks like a win for the government. Analysts are high confidence, actually, 75 to 92%, that these sanctions will temporarily disrupt things. They'll make it harder to get those listed precursors and lab equipment. Freezing assets, the automated bank screening, that should definitely cause headaches in Culiacán and Mazatlan. The estimate is for maybe 2 to 6 weeks of disruption.
Okay, hold on. 2 to 6 weeks. After bringing out the counter-terrorism designation, hitting the core family, all these companies, you're saying the intel predicts maybe a month and a half of impact max. Why should anyone listening believe this is more than just, a temporary speed bump?
That's precisely the critique, the tension embedded right there in the sources, that short-term disruption is expected. But the long-term forecast is pessimistic. The intelligence is also highly likely, same confidence, 75 to 92%, that the network will just reconstitute. They'll stand up new shell companies, find new front people, likely within 30 days. They're basically expected to repeat the same playbook they used after the smaller 2023 sanctions, just faster and maybe even more effectively this time.
So how did they get around these global financial sanctions so quickly, especially the terrorism-related ones?
Financial evasion. That's the predicted route. The consensus in the intelligence is that the money flows will shift almost immediately. It's considered likely 55 to 74% confidence, so it's still pretty high, that they'll push more money through Chinese Money Laundering Networks, CMLNs, and also use more non-bank channels, things harder to screen, to bypass the scrutiny triggered by that SDGT designation.
Right, CMLNs. These are sophisticated operations, often dealing in high volumes, moving money fast, sometimes using trade or complex financial instruments. So if the official banking system gets too hot because of the sanctions, the cartel just pivots to these underground networks that specialize in getting drug dollars back to Mexico as pesos.
Precisely. And it's not just financial adaptation, it's geographical too. The sources suggest it's likely moderate confidence here, 55 to 74%, that the cartel will shift sourcing efforts, move away from the heavily watched areas, and maybe use other Pacific ports more like Manzanillo to replace the logistics nodes hit near Sinaloa. That kind of flexibility is why it's such a tough long-term battle for the agencies involved. You mentioned 32 DEA offices, FBI, HSI, CBP.
Yeah, it's like fighting an enemy that can just molt, shed its corporate skin overnight, switch ports of entry in weeks. That speed, that velocity of change, seems to be the core challenge.
Which leads to the ultimate bottom line question, right? What does this actually mean for fentanyl availability inside the United States? Surely this massive October 6th sanction package hitting the precursors, that has to mean less fentanyl on the streets immediately.
You'd think so, but apparently not necessarily. The source is actually rated as unlikely. Only a 25 to 44% chance, moderate confidence, that we'll see an immediate, measurable drop in U.S. fentanyl availability within the first 30 days.
And that seems counterintuitive given the huge seizures you mentioned earlier, right? But it makes sense when you factor in a couple things. One, the cartels likely have significant existing inventories already stockpiled. Two, they operate multiple parallel supply chains. Hitting one node doesn't shut everything down. Other pipelines can absorb the shock, at least temporarily.
And there's that fundamental challenge with fentanyl itself. Compared to older drugs like heroin or cocaine, its potency is just off the charts, which means the TCOs, the criminal organizations, can meet demand with a much smaller physical amount of product by weight. If you only need to smuggle a few kilos instead of hundreds, it makes finding it, interdicting it, exponentially harder, especially hidden in passenger vehicles at the land border, which is the primary route.
Absolutely. And another major uncertainty is enforcement within Mexico. The U.S. can issue sanctions, but how hard will Mexican authorities actually crack down on these specific named companies long term? The intelligence suggests it's roughly even odds, 45 to 54% confidence, basically a coin toss depending heavily on shifting political will down there.
Okay, so given all that uncertainty, what's the nightmare scenario? What's the most dangerous potential outcome identified in the sources from this kind of crackdown?
Well, the concern is blowback. That major enforcement actions, big raids or seizures, could actually trigger more violence. Violent intimidation by Los Chapitos aimed at local officials in Sinaloa or rivals as they aggressively reassert control after the disruption. Another risk is that it pushes them to rely even more heavily on foreign intermediaries, maybe making those Chinese chemical inputs even harder to trace and mask the origins for the next round of sanctions.
So let's try and synthesize this. We see this clear tension playing out. The U.S. government deploys its most powerful financial weapons, the SDGP tag, counter-terror authorities targeting these critical supply chain choke points in Culiacán. But they're up against this Los Chapitos network that's just built for speed and evasion, rapid corporate layering, disposable front people, agile financial workarounds.
Yeah, and the real takeaway for you listening is this. The true measure of these October sanctions wasn't the headlines that day, it's what happens next. How quickly do new shell companies pop up in Culiacán? That's the operational indicator. Do we see spikes in suspicious activity reports, the SARs filed by banks, that confirm a big shift towards those Chinese money laundering networks for financing? That's what needs watching in the coming weeks and months.
We definitely see sanctions forcing adaptation, pushing the network to evolve. But it leaves us with this fundamental, maybe unsettling question. If Los Chapitos can effectively ditch a corporate identity in days, rebuild a multi-million-dollar supply chain component in under a month, what level of sustained, globally synchronized enforcement would it actually take to break a system that's seemingly built on such rapid resilience, such constant reconstitution? That's something to think about as this story inevitably continues to unfold.